Imagine a man who didn't just study crime. He became obsessed with committing the perfect one. 1. Meet Bryan Kohberger, the brilliant Ph.D. student who treated a quadruple homicide like a final exam.
To truly catch a criminal, one must first...
One quiet town, 4 vibrant lives, and a predator who knew every forensic trick in the book to stay invisible. Now, in March 2026, the final chilling truth has been unsealed, and it's a nightmare you'll never forget. But he made one fatal mistake, a single oversight that turned this mastermind into the world's biggest failure. Hey everyone. Today, I am taking you into a story that changed the way America looks at safety and college life forever. We aren't just talking about a crime. We are talking about a calculated, cold-blooded massacre that happened in a place where nobody ever thought they'd need to lock their doors. We are talking about the Idaho student murders and the man behind the mask, Bryan Kohberger. As we sit here in March 2026, the legal proceedings have finally concluded, but the psychological scars on the town of Moscow, Idaho, remain as deep as ever. To truly grasp the weight of this tragedy, we need to go back to the beginning, before the blood, before the sirens, and before the world knew the name of a criminology student who thought he could commit the perfect crime. Moscow, Idaho, was a picturesque college town tucked away in the rolling hills of the Palouse. It was a place where life revolved around the University of Idaho. The students were known as vandals, and they were a tight-knit community. Before November 2022, Moscow was statistically one of the safest cities in the United States. In fact, it hadn't recorded a single homicide in over 7 years. People walked the streets at 3 a.m. without a second thought. Students left their bikes unlocked, and many residents didn't even know where their house keys were because they simply never used them. It was a safe haven. But that sense of security was a fragile glass that was about to be shattered into a million pieces. The heart of our story is a house located at 1122 King Road. It was a large, 3-story building that sat on a dead-end street, partially hidden by trees. To any outsider, it was just a typical college rental. To the students who lived there, it was a home filled with laughter, dreams, and constant social gatherings. It was known as a party house, a place where friends were always welcome. 6 people lived there, but on the night of November 12, 2022, 4 vibrant souls were spending their last hours on Earth. Let's talk about who these victims were, because they deserve to be remembered as more than just a case file. Madison Mogen, or Maddie to her friends, was 21 years old and a senior marketing major. She was the kind of person who could make anyone smile. She was hardworking, balanced her studies with a job at a local Greek restaurant, and was looking forward to her upcoming graduation. By her side, as she had been since preschool, was Kaylee Goncalves. Kaylee was also 21 and Maddie's absolute best friend. Their bond was legendary in Moscow. They were inseparable. Kaylee was a fireball of energy. She had just bought a brand new Range Rover and was planning to move to Texas for a lucrative tech job. This weekend in Moscow was supposed to be her victory lap, a final celebration with her friends before she started her adult life. On the second floor lived Xana Kernodle, 20, another marketing student with a sharp wit and a huge heart. Xana was a member of the Pi Beta Phi sorority and was known for being the life of any gathering. That night, she was with her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, who was also 20. Ethan was a star athlete and a triplet from Washington State. He didn't even live in the house. He was just staying over to be with Xana. Ethan was a member of the Sigma Chi fraternity and was loved by everyone for his easygoing nature and kind spirit. These 4 young people represented the absolute best of their generation. They were bright, ambitious, and loved. They had no idea that a predator had been watching them for months. As Saturday night, November 12th, turned into the early morning of Sunday, November 13th, Moscow was buzzing with its typical weekend energy. Maddie and Kaylee spent their evening at the Corner Club, a popular local bar. Surveillance footage and social media posts show them laughing, taking selfies, and enjoying their time together. Around 1:30 a.m., they were spotted at a late-night food truck called the Grub Truck. The live stream from that truck became a haunting piece of evidence later on. It showed Maddie and Kaylee ordering mac and cheese, chatting with other students, and acting like any other college girls. They got a ride home from a private party and walked through their front door at 1:56 a.m. Meanwhile, Xana and Ethan had been at the Sigma Chi fraternity house nearby. They returned to the King Road house around 1:45 a.m. By 2 a.m., the house was mostly settled. The two other roommates, who lived on the first floor, were already in their rooms. The house should have been a fortress of sleep and safety. But at 4 a.m., the atmosphere changed. Xana received a DoorDash delivery. She was still awake, eating her food and scrolling through TikTok. She was active on her phone at 4:12 a.m. She had no idea that a white Hyundai Elantra had already circled the house 4 times in the last hour. The driver was Bryan Kohberger, and he was waiting for the perfect moment of silence. At approximately 4:04 a.m., the car stopped. A figure dressed in all black, wearing a tactical mask and gloves, stepped out into the freezing Idaho air. He entered the house through the sliding glass door on the second floor, which was unlocked. He didn't hesitate. He knew the layout. He went straight to the 3rd floor, toward Maddie's room. Maddie and Kaylee were sleeping in the same bed, just as they had done since they were children. The killer pulled out a massive fixed-blade K-bar knife, a weapon designed for combat. What followed was a massacre so brutal it defied human comprehension. He attacked Maddie and Kaylee in their sleep, unleashing a level of violence that left the room looking like a war zone. They never stood a chance. They died together, just as they had lived. He then descended to the 2nd floor. He entered Xana's room. This is where the perfect plan began to fall apart. Xana was awake. When the killer entered, she didn't just cower. She fought back with everything she had. Forensic reports would later show that she tried to grab the blade, resulting in deep, defensive wounds on her fingers. She was a fighter until her very last breath. Ethan, who was beside her, was caught in the middle of the struggle and was also murdered in the frenzied attack. The killer was efficient, cold, and fast. But as he was leaving, he was seen. Dylan Mortensen, one of the roommates on the 1st floor, had been awoken by the noise. She thought she heard Kaylee playing with her dog, or perhaps Xana crying. She opened her door 3 times. The 3rd time, she stood face to face with a tall man in a black mask. She saw his bushy eyebrows staring back at her. She froze in absolute terror, a frozen shock that kept her rooted to the spot. The killer, for reasons only he knows, walked right past her and out the back door, leaving a house of horrors behind him. In less than 20 minutes, 4 lives were gone. The predator vanished into the night, leaving no obvious clues, no fingerprints, and a town that was about to wake up to a nightmare it could never have imagined. The morning was strangely quiet. It wasn't until 11:58 a.m., nearly 8 hours after the attack, that a 911 call was finally placed from a roommate's phone. The initial report was for an unconscious person. But when the first officers arrived on the scene, they didn't find someone who had simply fainted. They found a house that looked like a slaughterhouse. There was so much blood that it was literally seeping through the floorboards and staining the exterior foundation of the house. The victims, Maddie, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan, had been attacked with such ferocity that even the most hardened investigators were visibly traumatized. Word spread like wildfire. By that afternoon, the news had broken. 4 University of Idaho students were dead. The panic that followed was unlike anything Moscow had ever seen. Students didn't wait for the semester to end. They packed their bags and fled. Those who stayed turned their homes into fortresses. Sales of pepper spray, deadbolts, and security cameras skyrocketed. For the next 7 weeks, the Moscow Police Department and the FBI were under immense pressure. Every day, the media asked the same question: who did this, and why haven't you caught them? The public was frustrated, and internet sleuths on TikTok and Reddit began accusing innocent people, ruining lives in the process. But behind the scenes, the police were quietly following a trail of breadcrumbs left by a man who thought he was a genius. The first major break came from the cameras. Investigators spent thousands of man-hours reviewing CCTV footage from every doorbell camera and business in the area. They spotted a white sedan circling the King Road neighborhood right around the time of the murders. It was a white Hyundai Elantra. This car was caught speeding away from the scene at 4:20 a.m. On December 7th, the police put out a public bolo, "Be on the lookout," for the vehicle. Little did they know, the owner of that car was already on their radar. While the world was looking for the car, the lab was looking at the evidence. In the third-floor bedroom, right next to Maddie's body, the killer had made one catastrophic mistake. He had left behind the leather sheath for his K-bar knife. It was sitting right there on the bed. When forensic experts processed that sheath, they found a tiny microscopic trace of DNA on the metal snap. This was the silver bullet. However, there was a problem. The DNA didn't match anyone in the criminal database. The killer had no prior record. He was a ghost. This is where the investigation turned to cutting-edge science. Investigative genetic genealogy, IgG. This is the same technology used to find the Golden State Killer. The FBI took that tiny speck of DNA and uploaded it to public ancestry databases, the kind where people upload their DNA to find long-lost cousins. They weren't looking for a direct match. They were looking for a family tree. After weeks of tireless work, they found a branch that led straight to the Kohberger family. And right in the middle of that tree was a 28-year-old Ph.D. student named Bryan Kohberger. Now this is where the story gets truly disturbing. Bryan wasn't just some random guy. He was a doctoral candidate in criminology at Washington State University, which is only about 10 miles away from the crime scene. He spent his days studying the very techniques the police were using to catch him. He had even posted a survey on Reddit months earlier, asking criminals how they felt during their crimes and how they avoided detection. He was essentially a student of murder, and it seemed he had decided to turn his academic interest into a gruesome reality. He continued going to his classes after the murders, acting as if nothing had happened, even engaging in discussions about the case with his students. He thought his knowledge of forensics made him untouchable. But the FBI was already closing in. They tracked his white Elantra across the country as he drove home to Pennsylvania with his father for the winter break. They followed him for thousands of miles, watching his every move. When he arrived at his parents' house in the Poconos, undercover agents began a 24/7 stakeout. They saw Bryan acting incredibly paranoid. He was seen wearing surgical gloves in the middle of the night, taking his personal trash and putting it into his neighbor's garbage cans to avoid leaving his DNA for the police to find. On the night of December 27th, agents made their move. They intercepted a bag of trash from the Kohberger residence. The lab worked through the night, and the results were undeniable. The DNA from the trash belonged to the biological father of the person who left DNA on the knife sheath in Idaho. It was a 99.9% match. The trap was set. In the early morning hours of December 30th, 2022, a SWAT team executed a high-risk warrant. They smashed through the windows and doors of the Kohberger home, taking Bryan into custody. When the news of his arrest broke, the world was stunned. How could a brilliant Ph.D. student be capable of such a thing? As he was extradited back to Idaho, the mastermind was finally unmasked. But the mystery was far from over. Why did he do it? And how would a man who studied the law try to manipulate it to go free? In early 2023, Bryan Kohberger was extradited back to Idaho. The image of him stepping off that small plane, flanked by guards and wearing a red jumpsuit, became an overnight sensation. He looked calm, almost eerily so. This wasn't the look of a man who was terrified of the system. This was the look of a man who believed he was smarter than the system. Inside the courtroom, Kohberger's demeanor remained cold and indifferent. He sat through hours of grueling testimony, often staring straight ahead with a mask of clinical detachment. It was as if he were a scientist observing his own life as a research project. He initially chose to stand silent during his arraignment, a legal maneuver that forced the judge to enter a not guilty plea on his behalf. He was betting that his knowledge of criminology and the technicalities of the law would somehow set him free. But the prosecution was building a mountain of evidence that even a Ph.D. couldn't climb. As the pretrial hearings unfolded throughout 2023 and 2024, the public learned just how deep his obsession went. Investigators revealed that Bryan's cell phone had pinged near the 1122 King Road house at least 12 times in the months leading up to the murders. Most of these visits happened late at night or in the very early hours of the morning. He wasn't just a random attacker, he was a stalker. He had spent weeks learning the patterns of the house, who came home when, which doors were left unlocked, and when the lights finally went out. The digital trail didn't stop there. Forensic experts found that Bryan had been following several of the victims on Instagram. He had even sent several direct messages to one of the girls. She never replied, likely never even seeing them in her requested folder, but that didn't stop him. In his mind, he had created a connection that didn't exist. This was a man fueled by a toxic mix of academic arrogance and social isolation. We also learned more about his visual snow syndrome, a condition he had complained about for years on internet forums, claiming it made him feel disconnected and deprived of emotion. It was a chilling look into the mind of someone who had spent his life trying to understand human behavior because he couldn't feel it himself. One of the most powerful moments in the entire trial was the testimony of the surviving roommate, Dylan Mortensen. Looking directly at Kohberger, she recounted the absolute horror of that night. She described the bushy eyebrows that had become a central part of the police's description. She talked about the frozen shock that kept her from calling the police for 8 hours, a delay that the defense tried to use to discredit her. But the jury saw the truth. A young woman whose brain had simply shut down to protect her from a trauma no human is meant to endure. Her bravery in that courtroom was the first major blow to Bryan's mastermind persona. As the case moved toward 2025, the pressure was mounting. The state of Idaho was prepared to seek the death penalty, a move that the victims' families, particularly Kaylee's father, Steve Goncalves, strongly supported. But in a move that polarized the nation in July 2025, Bryan Kohberger's defense team approached the prosecution with a plea deal. To avoid the possibility of execution, Bryan agreed to plead guilty to all 4 counts of first-degree murder. The families were torn, but ultimately, they agreed to the deal to ensure he would never have a chance at an appeal or a release. The judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life terms, without the possibility of parole. Bryan Kohberger will spend every remaining second of his life in a maximum security cell. Now, as we sit here in March 2026, new information has finally been unsealed that makes this case even more disturbing than we initially thought. We now know that the level of violence used that night was staggering. A final forensic report revealed that the 4 victims were stabbed a combined total of over 150 times. This wasn't just a quick kill and run. This was an explosion of suppressed rage. The report also gave us a new hero, Xana Kernodle. We now know from the struggle marks and the positioning of the evidence that Xana fought with a strength that actually injured Bryan. She managed to grab the knife during the attack, causing deep lacerations to his arms. In a shocking revelation from early 2026, it was discovered that Bryan had actually shown up to his criminology classes the very next day with those scratches. When a student asked him what happened, he claimed his neighbor's dog had gotten aggressive. He had even used professional-grade makeup to cover the marks during his final weeks at Washington State University. He was hiding in plain sight, sitting in a classroom discussing the psychology of killers, while his own victim's blood was still being processed by a lab just 10 miles away. The house at 1122 King Road is no longer there. In late 2024, the University of Idaho made the decision to demolish the building. It was a house of horrors that the community needed to move past. Today, there is an empty lot where the house once stood, but the university is currently finishing a healing garden on that site. It features 4 monuments, one for Maddie, one for Kaylee, one for Xana, and one for Ethan. It is a place of peace, designed to ensure that their lives are remembered for how they lived, not just how they died. Bryan Kohberger is currently serving his time in a facility where he is kept in nearly total isolation for his own safety. Reports from prison guards suggest that he still spends hours in the law library, convinced that he can find a technicality to overturn his plea. He still sees himself as a mastermind, but the world sees him for what he truly is, a failure. He failed as a student, he failed as a criminal, and he failed as a human being. He thought he could outsmart the world, but he was caught because he was too arrogant to remember a simple leather knife sheath. The Idaho student murders taught us a grim lesson. Evil doesn't always look like a monster in a movie. Sometimes it looks like a quiet Ph.D. student sitting in the back of a classroom. But it also taught us about the resilience of a community and the power of modern science to bring justice to those who think they are untouchable. As the sun sets on this case in 2026, we honor the memories of those 4 bright stars. So, I have to ask you, do you think justice was served with a life sentence, or was the plea deal a mistake? Does a man like Bryan Kohberger deserve any mercy at all? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your perspective on this. If you found this deep dive insightful, make sure to let me know which case we should break down next. Maybe the recent developments in the Menendez brothers case or the Gilgo Beach investigation? Thanks for sticking with me until the end. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more true crime and hit that like button. See you in the next case. Stay vigilant.